Hello, I'm Janessa and welcome to my channel. In this video, we are going to review some of the latest breaking news about the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni case. In my last video about the case, the Mercury retrograde case review video, I talked about how we should be watching the dates April 14th to April 19th. I'm recording this on Saturday, April 19th, and sure enough, we have had some interesting developments, potentially very major developments in the case in the last few days. In particular, we have some breaking news about the subpoena and the lawsuit that were leveraged to obtain the text messages and other information about Justin Baldoni from Stephanie Jones and Jones Work PR that ultimately were passed to the New York Times via Blake Lively. Those now infamous text messages that were used in the scathing article that the New York Times published about Justin Baldoni late last year. I know it's quite a web of relationships and information, isn't it? But what we'll get into in this video is breaking down some of the specifics that we know as of now about this subpoena and that lawsuit that were the mechanisms leveraged to allow that information to flow from Stephanie Jones to Blake Lively to the New York Times. And of course, we'll look specifically at this as well through the lens of astrology. If you enjoy this kind of content, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments below what you think about this latest development. Without further ado, let's get into the analysis. First of all, I want to give a shout out to the content creator Katie at Without a Crystal Ball. You can find her on YouTube at Without a Crystal Ball. She has a great video in which I believe she was the first person to break this news and finding the evidence of this lawsuit, which we're looking at here. Her participation and great work digging into the details is another example of, I think, one of the interesting themes within this overall case between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. And that's the relationship between content creators and traditional mainstream media. There have been moments where there's been some tension between these two different camps of information processing, gathering, and distribution. And I want to give credit where it's due to Katie and her great work with uncovering this specific information. I'm also aware that the Daily Mail was putting together some articles around this topic as well. And I actually first heard of this breaking news from the Ask Two Lawyers YouTube channel, which you should definitely check them out as well. They are two practicing lawyers who are breaking down different aspects of this case. I love watching their content and I highly recommend listening to what they have to say because of their expertise when it comes to the legal considerations of the back and forth and events within this case. And let's look just briefly at the actual documentation here, which is part of what Katie Without a Crystal Ball broke on her channel. We have the documentation showing a case being opened in the state of New York on September 27th, 2024 at 6:28 p.m. And the plaintiff in this case is Van Zandt Inc., which we now know is owned by Blake Lively and likely Ryan Reynolds as well. What's interesting about this case and something that the Ask Two Lawyers channel brought up in their analysis of this development is that the defendants in this case are does 1 through 10, meaning the defendants were not actually specifically identified within this documentation. And this was filed on behalf of Blake Lively by Manat, Phelps and Phillips, which is her current counsel in her lawsuit against Justin Baldoni. From what I understand, they're a very well-known and prominent legal firm here in the United States. And what this allowed them to do, this case opening here, as the Ask Two Lawyers explain it, in the state of New York, there isn't a waiting period for issuing subpoenas after a case has been opened. So within a few days of opening this case here, it allowed Manat, Phelps and Phillips to issue a subpoena to Stephanie Jones. Stephanie Jones is the PR professional who had the cell phone containing the text messages and other information that ultimately were used in the New York Times article, the scathing article about Justin Baldoni. There's been a lot of speculation and back and forth around how exactly did Blake Lively get her hands on the information from that cell phone. And there's been speculation that it was through some sort of subpoena tied to a case, but no one had yet identified what that case was. And thanks to Katie, we now know it's this case. So that subpoena that was issued to Stephanie Jones was how they were able to obtain the information. But the kicker, from what I understand based on what I've reviewed from Ask Two Lawyers and other content creators, is that because the defendants in this case are considered does or unidentified individuals or parties, Justin Baldoni and the Wayfarer parties were not notified of that subpoena, even though though it was their information that was included in that information transfer under the subpoena. From what I gather from the Ask Two Lawyers channel, this was all done by the book according to stipulations in New York State. But Manat, Phelps, and Phillips are receiving some heat now from content creators and other lawyer content creators specifically, calling into question whether this was truly in good faith, or was this more simply a ploy that technically speaking might pass to get access to sensitive information that could be used to harm Justin Baldoni. I know that's a lot to unpack, but I highly recommend checking out Katie's channel. She actually goes through this document. I believe she reads through it in detail. But what we're going to do is look at the astrology of this, because as an astrology channel, that's really the specific lens I'm using to look at this case. And what's great about legal documentation is so often we have a specific date, location, and even on this document we have the time. So let's look at the astrology and bump it up against Blake Lively's birth chart and see what we find to educate ourselves about the energetic context for this filing for this case. I'm sharing my screen so you can see Blake Lively's birth chart in the middle of the screen, and around that are the transits for September 27th, 2024 at 6:28 p.m. in New York, when the Van Zandt lawsuit was filed. We don't have time to do a deep dive of the transits on that date, so I'll call out just a couple things that I see initially that really stand out to me. And of course, if you want to add in, let me know in the comments below if you see anything that I missed that you think is interesting. Something that stands out to me immediately is how we have Mercury in the sky at 2 degrees of Libra, almost exactly conjunct Blake Lively's natal south node at 2 degrees of Libra. This of course makes it exactly opposite her natal north node at 2 degrees of Aries. And if you've been watching my coverage of this case, you know for a while I have been highlighting and calling attention to Blake Lively's natal north node in Aries as a very important point to watch in this case, because I do believe that the unfolding of this case is very closely tied to what we're seeing with the energetic context with Neptune moving into the sign of Aries this year in 2025. My hypothesis is that some version of this case could likely go to trial, and if it doesn't go to trial, I do think it's possible there could be a settlement very close to that trial date. I should probably do a whole other video breaking down that hypothesis that I have, but the quick version is that Neptune at that point will be very closely conjunct Blake Lively's natal north node in Aries, and Saturn, the planet of consequences, will conjoin Neptune in a very significant planetary event on February 20th, 2026. Because that is happening just before the trial, I think it could tie into just the overall energetic context for the case finally going to trial and there being consequences for individuals' actions as a result of this case. I also think it's possible, because that conjunction between Saturn and Neptune is happening just before the trial is supposed to start, that perhaps there could be a settlement coming right before the trial is set to begin. Now, I'm not a legal expert. I don't know if that's actually possible or how common that is to have a settlement occur right before a trial date, but it is an idea that I've wondered about, and I'd be very curious to hear from a lawyer or a legal expert if that's even possible. Now, keep in mind that Saturn and Neptune will get very close to a conjunction in July of this year, 2025, which is another part of that hypothesis that I have, that perhaps they could near some sort of settlement leading into July of this year, but ultimately something falling through. Another way one could interpret this is perhaps there's something major in July, maybe a part of the case or a party is dismissed from the case or backs out from the case. I'm not exactly sure what the full range of possibilities are there legally, but I do think we should pay very close attention to that July 2025 time range, and also of course what is going to happen potentially right before the trial date in 2026. But with all that being said, let's get back to this current time frame when this lawsuit was filed that ultimately allowed the subpoena to be used to obtain the information from the cell phone that was in Stephanie Jones' possession. Because it really stands out to me that Mercury in the sky was essentially conjunct the south node in Libra. Mercury is the planet associated with lawyers, and so this was a development that came about through the action of Blake Lively's lawyers. And Libra for Blake Lively is in her third house of direct communications and writing. So literally it is connected to filing this document. It's also important to note that Mars at this point was in Cancer around 13 degrees, which Cancer is Blake Lively's 12th house. And the 12th house can be associated with trials and judgments. I did a whole other video around the synastry or relationships between Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Ryan Reynolds, and the entire Mars retrograde cycle. If you're interested in diving in deeper to Mars and its impact on Blake Lively and this case, I highly recommend that video. But what I find striking about Mars in Blake Lively's 12th house and in Cancer, I've heard Chris Brennan, who's an astrologer I've learned a lot from and very much respect, describe the 12th house as essentially the house of self-undoing. It is a house associated with our enemies or people we don't necessarily get along with, but it can also be connected to the actions we may take that contribute to our own downfall. And it is speculated now that the actions of Manat, Phelps, and Phillips may impact Blake Lively and the Lively parties negatively. It all depends on what this federal court judge, Judge Lyman, decides to do. And of course, that will be in response to whatever actions Brian Friedman, Justin Baldoni's lawyer, takes now that this information has become public. So there's still a lot that remains to be seen. What's also interesting about this lawsuit is that it was actually discontinued or withdrawn right before Blake Lively submitted her CRD complaint and the New York Times published its article about Justin Baldoni. So let's look at the astrology of that date as well to see how it bumps up against what we see here with Mercury conjunct Blake Lively's South Node in Libra and Mars in Cancer in Blake Lively's 12th house. Here we have the chart for December 19th, 2024 at 10:33 a.m. in New York, New York. What's interesting here is that Mercury at 2 degrees of Libra has been replaced by the South Node in the sky at 2 degrees of Libra, which also means that the North Node in the sky is at 2 degrees of Libra. So around this date, Blake Lively was actually experiencing her nodal return. It was actually 2 days prior to the withdrawal of this lawsuit that she had her exact nodal return. So once again, we're seeing transits of planets in the sky hitting her natal North Node in Aries, and as a result as well, in relationship with her natal South Node in Libra, being tied quite closely to significant dates in this case. And what does that mean? What that means is that when we continue to follow this case and I provide coverage about what we're seeing, we're going to pay close attention to any transits that are hitting her nodes because they seem to be pretty significant in the unfolding of this case. And why could that be? Well, there are a lot of different interpretations of the nodes of the moon. Generally speaking, I tend to see the North Node in particular as a point in our chart that is connected to our evolutionary growth. And when we say evolutionary growth, we're not talking about short-term growth or changes in our lives or our sense of who we are. We're talking about the ways that we evolve over the course of an entire lifetime. And a nodal return can be a point when we're being asked to take a close look at our growth trajectory over our lives. How far have we really come, and where do we still have growth and learning and development to experience? In my opinion, it seems like this relationship that Blake Lively has had with her lawyers and all of the circumstances surrounding the New York Times article, how this information was obtained, it seems like this is a very significant event in her life and an invitation to take a much closer look at herself and her role in how her life events are unfolding. And it's an invitation. What one does with astrology, with energy, with these patterns that might come up to the surface at various points in our lives, that's up to us to decide what we do with it. It's not like there's a requirement saying, oh, you need to learn these XYZ lessons based on what's going on in your life. You can certainly do that. You can grow from maybe mistakes you've made, or I can grow from mistakes I've made. We can learn and develop and decide to do better and be better over time. But that isn't a guarantee. It takes our use of our free will and our action and a certain kind of mindset to evolve in a better direction for ourselves, one that's potentially more aligned with who we are or our values. And if you believe in a sense of soul, you could think of it as evolution that's more in alignment with our soul purpose or soul calling. Will Blake Lively use the events of this lawsuit and everything that's going on for the betterment of her evolution? That's for her to decide. The other thing I'd like to point out when it comes to this chart is not only is Blake Lively having her nodal return around this time, but we also have Mercury at 7 degrees of Sagittarius, which means it's forming a square with her natal Mercury in Virgo. As I said, Mercury can signify lawyers, but Mercury can also just signify in general our mental thinking, our processing, the way that we make decisions and communicate. I'd be very interested to know behind the scenes what was going on for Blake Lively mentally around this time. Obviously, this was just a few days before she filed her CRD complaint and the New York Times article came out. I imagine it could have been a pretty chaotic time for her, and I do wonder how she was making sense of these developments and coming to these decisions for herself, because I think it's pretty clear that the results of her actions are now playing out in a much more visible way. This is important to keep in mind because, as I said, we're also closely watching the planet Mars in how we review and analyze this case, and Mars, the planet of action, is at 5 degrees of Leo in her first house. So Mars is in its retrograde officially at the time that this lawsuit was withdrawn, meaning that this lawsuit is tied up in that Mars retrograde cycle. And one of the things that we'll do next is actually look at the transits in the sky for April 17th, when Katie from Without a Crystal Ball revealed this information, because we want to check out what was going on with Blake Lively's nodes, as well as where was Mars in the sky, where's Mercury in the sky, to see if these threads that were woven into the energy of September 27th and December 19th, if those continue into what's happening currently. Because like I said, all of this was hidden at that time from public view, but now that the Mars retrograde has completed and Mars is moving through its final stage of its post-shadow period, we're seeing a lot of this information come up to the surface. So let's go ahead and check that out next. Here we have the transits for April 17th, 2025. I've put a time of 10 p.m. I don't know for sure when that video from Katie actually dropped. So let's check out what's going on. Of course, it's no surprise. We have both Neptune and Mercury fairly close to Blake Lively's north node at 2 degrees of Aries. Neptune is at 0 degrees and Mercury is at 1 degree. We also have the Sun about to conjoin Blake Lively's natal Jupiter in retrograde. The Sun is at 28 degrees of Aries and Jupiter in her chart is at 29 degrees of Aries. And this was a configuration that I specifically called out in my last video, and why I was saying pay attention to April 14th to April 19th, because I saw that Mercury was getting close to her natal north node, the Sun was getting close to her natal Jupiter, and so I thought that there could be something revealed or some sort of development that would come up in the case. And sure enough, it seems like this exposure of this information is tied to these transits to both Blake Lively's natal north node and her natal Jupiter. We also have Mars at 29 degrees of Cancer, meaning it's in the final degree of Cancer and its post-retrograde shadow in that sign. Keep in mind that the Mars retrograde spanned both Leo and Cancer, so it won't clear fully its retrograde shadow until it passes, I believe, 6 degrees of Leo, which is coming up not that long from now. And actually, another key transit that I called out in my last video was this ingress for Mars from Cancer into Leo. And if we advance this just one day, you see here how Mars has now moved into Leo. So energetically, these seem to be the trigger points associated with this lawsuit and the subpoena coming to light officially. This slide is actually part of the slides that I included in that last video that I'm referencing. And you'll see here the planetary transits on the left. The one that we're looking at in particular is that Mercury and Neptune being closely conjunct in Aries, which happened on the 17th, and Mars moving into Cancer on April 18th. And as I've already mentioned, how Mercury and the Sun were closely conjunct Blake Lively's natal north node and her Jupiter in her birth chart. Of course, you could go back and watch that whole video, and I recommend you do if you're interested in hearing a more detailed review of the upcoming astrology. I also did a pretty in-depth review of the events of the case during Mercury retrograde, but I'll share this slide as well from that video just because I think it's pretty important. It's showing the upcoming transits April 26th to the 30th. This is the other stretch of days where I felt like we could see some sort of development come up in the case, and that's for a few reasons. And as I said, I'm recording this on Saturday, April 19th, so this hasn't happened yet, but I've been watching this because we'll see Mars in Leo forming an opposition with Pluto in Aquarius around April 26th. That's just happening in the sky for everyone. And you'll see how Mars Mars in Leo in this middle column, I've called out how it's going to have specific configurations with both Ryan Reynolds' birth chart and Justin Baldoni's birth chart. So I'm curious if there could be some sort of development in the case that's more specific to Baldoni or Ryan Reynolds. We also have the new moon happening on April 27th, the next day, and Venus is moving from Pisces into Aries. You can watch that video in depth or take a read of these bullet points that I've put together. But all three individuals are having significant configurations between the planets in the sky and planets in their birth charts, which is why I thought that it could be a time where we see something come up. And I know we're still waiting to hear back from the judge around the multiple motions to dismiss in this case. And I'm specifically wondering if there will be something related to the New York Times around the 26th to the 30th. And it could also just be further developments with what we found out about Stephanie Jones and Jones' work. And if the birth time that I have for Ryan Reynolds is correct, it means that both Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds have Jupiter retrograde in their 9th house in their natal charts. Why is this significant? Well, the 9th house is connected to themes around the law, publishing, so media, public relations. And Jupiter in retrograde suggests that there's something about that planet in that area of life for them that's inverted or shows up differently than usual for other people who might have that planet direct in the 9th house. And I've wondered, could this relate to or signify something around how some of their behaviors or actions allegedly with the New York Times and these different PR companies? There have been speculations and questions about whether or not things were really handled above board. It's a hot topic and something that's going to continue to get a lot of attention. Because if the information about Justin Baldoni that ended up in the New York Times article was handled inappropriately and shared inappropriately, which is something a judge and or jury would have to determine, these issues could present major difficulty for the Lively parties moving forward. We'll just have to wait and see. Let's do a quick recap just because there are so many moving pieces and parts and I think it might be helpful. On April 17th, Katie from the YouTube channel Without a Crystal Ball broke the story that she had identified the lawsuit that was associated with the subpoena that was used to obtain the information from the cell phone that was in the possession of Stephanie Jones. This cell phone information was what was used and shared from Blake Lively to the New York Times so the New York Times could write its scathing article about Justin Baldoni. This, of course, is central to Justin Baldoni's defamation claims against Blake Lively and the Lively parties. We will have to see how Brian Friedman, Justin Baldoni's lawyer, moves forward, what types of motions he files, and of course the judge will have to rule on any of those motions. We're still waiting too to hear back from the judge around the various motions to dismiss in this case. Blake Lively filed a motion to dismiss, Ryan Reynolds filed a motion to dismiss, New York Times filed a motion to dismiss, and Jed Wallace also filed a motion to dismiss. And the events of this week do line up with the astrology that I highlighted around this time. Once again, we see more connections between the transits in the sky and specific points in Blake Lively's chart, including her natal north node at 2 degrees of Aries and her natal Jupiter in retrograde at 29 degrees of Aries. We've also seen how these events are tied into overarching Mercury transits and Mercury cycles, and it remains to be seen what else may come to the surface as we complete the post-shadow period for the Mars retrograde in Leo and Cancer. I've highlighted as well, pay attention to what could happen April 26th to the 30th, because that's the next pocket of time that I've identified just based on various transits that could tie to significant developments in the case. As always, thank you so much for being here. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What stood out to you? What do you think about this subpoena and the lawsuit? I'd love to hear about your reaction as well. Also, please like this video, subscribe to my channel if you enjoy this kind of content, and I look forward to connecting again soon.